In 2020, we had a Liberal Prime Minister in Ottawa. We had a very conservative Premier in Edmonton and a Republican in the White House who everyone thought was a narcissist and dangerously incompetent. And look what we have today. So really not much has changed.
Ed's the glass half full kind of guy.
Hi, I'm Rob Tremblay, and you're listening to Energy versus Climate, the show where my friends Ed Whittingham, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and David Keith debate today's climate and energy challenges. You'll note that I'm not Ed, and things are a little different today. Today, we'll be turning the tables on the hosts and asking a bit about the hosts themselves, how the show got started, how things have changed since the show started, and where things are going. And finally, it wouldn't be right for me to be here without asking a couple questions of my own. So at the end, we'll look to rapid fire some questions to the hosts on all things climate and energy. So without further ado, let's get into it. Hey, Sara and Ed, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's an honor to be on Energy versus Climate.
For the first time.
All right. So, Rob, what are we doing today?
Yeah, so I thought we'd kind of go, turn the tables on you folks. That's why I'm here. So to start off, so I guess, one thing I'd like to know is what were you each doing before the podcast? What kind of got you into starting the podcast together?
I'll jump in because I was a step ahead of Sarah on this podcast, at least. And I was not long after leaving the Pembina Institute, not long after having a bit of a pillow fight with Jason Kenney and his caucus over my role on the board of the Alberta Energy Regulator, and doing the work that I do today, which is still working on climate energy policy, running my own little consultancy, working with a few folks. And I can tell if we get into the origin story of the pod, I can share a few more of the gory details. But that's what I was doing.
Thanks. And how about you, Sarah?
I had to pull up my CV to remember where I was exactly when we started the podcast. But it was just before I joined the University of Calgary. So I was still remotely at the Colorado School of Mines in Golden, Colorado, which I actually never went to while I was working there, but had been to way back longer ago than I probably care to admit when I was an undergraduate and I did a summer internship at the National Renewable Energy Lab. So yeah, but I was doing energy and climate stuff. I had recently left my full-time role at Pembina, which is where I met Ed originally.
Nice. And yeah, and I think that kind of blends into kind of, another aspect of this question. And that's, have you always worked in energy and climate? Or is that kind of a transition or a pivot that you made in your career?
Yeah. Well, I guess if people are listening to the pod, they'll have to check out the video on YouTube if they want this, because I brought props. So this is my very first energy book. It's called, for people not watching, it's called What Makes Everything Go by Michael Ellison Ross. I think it was published in 1979 by the Yosemite Natural History Association. And it included great things I learned as a small child, like how when you put gas in a car, it will change to smoke and heat. And can you take that smoke and heat and change it back into gas? No. Why? So I guess you could say I was indoctrinated from an early age about the wonders of energy and physics and stuff. So I'd always had an interest of it. As I sort of hinted at there, as an undergrad, I actually did some work in energy. It's kind of funny looking back, and like that maybe talks about how much things have changed. Like there was no energy science degree you could have, right? We have one now at the University of Calgary, plugging a program in my department, Earth, Energy, and Environment. But I ended up going into physics. I got kind of caught up in the other thing that I thought was really cool, which was quantum mechanics, quantum information, and quantum computing, which has, funnily enough, become also quite big now.
Nice. And how about you, Ed?
Well, look at Sarah and her entry into climate and energy has been motivated by, the pursuit of scientific truth and a learned environment. My moves have all been motivated by money, drugs, and women. And climate is such a great opportunity for that. Actually, it was a shoulder injury. I was on the path becoming a professional basketball player, but a shoulder injury sent me down the path to climate and energy policy. So pretty typical. pretty typical for people getting into the field. Actually, I was working in the environmental sector, or I have been since the late 90s, and working for a small hardscrabble conservation, research, and advocacy organization working on parks and protected areas. The environment has always been near and dear to my heart. And back then, I was running this conservation research office. I was testifying before parliamentary committees. I was launching legal actions and even dancing in a bear suit in front of Fairmont hotels and, when needed, fixing photocopiers. I had a personal interest in climate, and it was sort of growing in the early 2000s when the G8 came to town. By coming to town, it came to Banff. That's where they hosted when Canada hosted the G8 summit back when it was a G8, when Russia was still in everyone's good books. And I, as a prominent local environmentalist, I was asked to speak to topics that they are dealing with, and climate was one of them. And I actually remember giving an interview on climate. It was on the equivalent of CBC NewsHour at the time. And it was the day that Greenpeace had just put solar panels on the roof of Ralph Klein as a protest. And I do believe our former Environment and Climate Change Minister, Stephen Guilbeault, was involved in that action. And I was speaking about climate, and they asked me about that. I said it was pretty funny. And then there ended up being this backlash against Greenpeace. And I thought my career as a climate activist and commentator was instantly over before it began. But that just whet my appetite. And after I finished off a master's degree, I signed up with the Pembina Institute, which focuses on climate energy, and the rest was career history for me.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think, I knew some of that, but I'm not sure I knew all of it. So I guess going back to kind of the formation of the podcast, how did the podcast kind of come to be? Whose idea was the podcast? Were you three always going to be the hosts, or was there, ever anyone else who was contemplated? Did you all know each other before the podcast, or was the podcast kind of how you got to know each other? So I've just kind of rapid fired some there, but would love some answers.
Infamously, someone else was proposed as the third co-host. I actually went and used this as an opportunity to check some notes. David Keith, who's unfortunately not available today, he and I had chatted about doing something creative together going back to the mid 2018 after I left the Pembina Institute. And we were throwing around ideas, and then it really was COVID. And I remember the day, it was March 15th, 2020, and David was sent back to Canada by Harvard so he could shelter in place. And we had him and his wife, Kirsten Anderson, over for dinner. And, in between courses, we again sort of batted around, well, let's do something, maybe a podcast. And then he and I went for a walk at the end of that month. And I looked, and I'd actually written up, called David and Ed's Excellent Podcast Concept, because I'd written other things called David and Ed's Excellent Adventures Concept, which for the sharp-eyed, you'll recognize the reference to Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventures from the 80s. During that walk, and this is now EvC lore, David infamously said, because I said, listen, I want a third co-host, and I really think we should have some gender balance and just not a bunch of dudes. So let's bring a dudette. And David said, who we should get? That right-wing radio host. What's her name? And I'm like, David, you mean Danielle Smith? And that's not a good idea on about 10 different levels. And again, instead suggested Sara. Having said that, both David and I could be, part of her crony capitalist inner circle today had we actually brought her on the pod. And, we could be living large, but we chose not to. I knew Sara would work together. And even though, it's not as lucrative, I think that was the best decision I've made for the pod ever.
I think it's a real watershed moment to think about how much things might have been different if Danielle Smith was on energy versus climate.
It's like a parallel universe we could explore to go into the quantum side of things.
And sorry, Sara, did you know Ed and David before the podcast?
I did. So I knew Ed because I worked for him at Pembina. He hired me. He didn't turn me away when I came to him, and I said, "Hey, could I have a job at Pembina?" And David, I did kind of know. Funnily enough, we like our physics backgrounds crossed over. I don't think I'd interacted with him a lot directly, but like we actually have a background in a very similar part of physics. And I talked to him at one point, I think, when I was kind of looking at making the transition from what I was doing before I was at Pembina, which was I was a consultant at McKinsey. I had talked with David kind of in that context previously.
And Sara, true to form, is kind of selling herself a bit short when she said she came to Pembina and asked for a job. She was, a top consultant at McKinsey, the firm. And, we started talking about it. And my first reaction, what? You want to leave that career and work for us? This NGO with below market salary and sporadic direction and dealing with high levels of ambiguity. And, we would have been, or I would have been absolutely foolish to have not snapped her up at the first opportunity. It's been wonderful to work with her ever since.
Well, it's been a lot of fun. I was really determined to have a work history that I could use to make sure anybody I met in Alberta could dislike me based on where I had worked previously.
Yeah, you've done a good job on that mission.
Perfect. And Ed, how did you and David meet? I'm not sure if I might have missed it, but I'm not sure if I've heard it. It sounds like you knew each other already and you came up with the podcast together.
Yeah, I want to say David and I have known each other not quite 25 years, but in between 20 and 25 years, shortly after I started at the Pembina Institute. And funny quirk, because I did a lot of work with his former brother-in-law, a wonderful man named Peter Poole. And I first met David socially through Peter. And then we reconnected when I finished my master's degree and started working with Pembina. Maybe it is 25 years. Maybe I've known him that long. But yeah, we kind of hit it off. As listeners will know, he's a quirky guy, but he is big-hearted and a wonderful human being, and equally fun to do a podcast with. Just as fun as doing this with Sara. So, sorry you can't be here today.
Yeah, David's, I think, a really important member of the podcast. I think he's often there to, put in kind of interesting counterfactual or something that, maybe the physics kind of makes sense, but then, not necessarily as much in the real world. One of the things I'll always remember about David is his idea of a transmission line from Arizona to Alberta because the solar resource is better in Arizona, which, I'm sure the physics works up for that, but try building, what would it be, like 3,000, 4,000 kilometers of linear infrastructure. And that's easier said than done.
Well, truth be told, we've been trying to replace David for a couple of years with AI, and we just haven't designed the right GPT yet. It's a tough algorithm to nail.
Fair enough. So I'm also interested in how things have changed since the podcast started. So I guess that's maybe the question I'll start with. How have things changed since the pod has been around, or are things pretty similar?
So in the energy space, I actually went to look and get some data because I was like, it feels like things have changed, but how much has it? So I went back to 2020, which was, I think, when we had our first episode. Most of the new data that I have is like 2025, 2024. So it's probably even more extreme. And what I found is, like, in a way, some things have changed a lot, right? So like the global EV sales in 2020 was about 4% of the market. It was 22% in the most recent number. And I think it's probably up to like a third for last year. So really dramatic change in EVs. Kind of similar numbers in solar in terms of the shift of what's being installed. There I have the actual production number. So it sounds a little less dramatic, but it was in 2020, about 3% of the world's energy came from solar. And 2024, I have almost 7%. So again, like, really, I think a meaningful change in what is happening in the energy transition from when we started till now. Although some things, we're still talking about pipelines, arguing about carbon pricing at the federal level. So some things haven't changed, but I think in terms of progress of actually steel in the ground and batteries on the roads, if you can say it that way, things are different.
Yeah, on the things that haven't changed front, in 2020, we had a Liberal Prime Minister in Ottawa. We had a very conservative premier in Edmonton and a Republican in the White House who everyone thought was a narcissist and dangerously incompetent. And look what we have today. So really not much has changed.
Ed's the glass half full kind of guy.
Yeah, I mean, the more stuff changes, the more stuff stays the same. I guess, are you surprised at either of those? Like, did you think things would have been a lot different, or, have been as much the same?
If I take like the high level metric, and I didn't do as much homework as Sarah did, roughly 2% of global GDP, about $2 trillion a year, is now going into clean energy and clean tech. And that's a massive amount of capital. And that's what makes me feel over the long term quite optimistic that we're going to decarbonize the global economy when you're spending that kind of money. Am I surprised at that? I don't think so. I think there is sort of a clear indicator of where it was going. I think there are other areas where it has been surprising, and we talk about this a lot on the pod. Not just wind scaling very quickly, but solar, and especially solar and batteries, are scaling very quickly. And I think, well, when we started in May 2020, we had the sense that, it's accelerating and it's going to exceed expectations. Solar has exceeded expectations beyond that as well. And it's on the path of being, cheapest new build electricity and potentially crushing other forms of new build electricity. And on that note, last fall, we did a whole show on that. So that, I think, continues to surprise.
Yeah, I should have done more homework and gone back to the first shows where we talked about this, and then we could see whether we were saying it or not. I had a certain sense that the writing was on the wall for this stuff, right? I mean, and that there was going to be that kind of growth in solar and EVs. And I mean, those were just two that I picked. You could go down the list. I don't think it took a crystal ball to kind of see that was coming. I think it has kind of reached the broader world outside of people that listen to Energy versus Climate that realize that this is going on. I would say it's probably fair. We're starting to see more of a retreat from, or a kind of hardening of the incumbent fossil fuel industry against that kind of change, right? And a real pullback of, Pathways has rebranded as, I think it's the Oil Sands Alliance, something like that. So a real kind of, and it's not the first time, honestly, like that you've seen this come and go. I remember the BP in the Beyond Petroleum world. That was one cycle before. But I also think it's fair to say we've gone through a bit of a cycle of maybe I would call it a little bit more honesty about what, fossil fuel companies are really planning to do in light of this transition.
Yeah, Sarah, are we going through our third or maybe fourth rebranding of the oil sands? I'm old enough to remember OSLI, the Oil Sands Leadership Initiative, and then COSIA, Canadian Oil Sands Innovation Alliance. And yeah, now it's new. So you start to feel old when you've been through 3 or 4 rebranding cycles.
Yeah, it's like now the overalls are back in fashion again too. That one I'm on board with though. They're comfortable. So
yeah. And one thing, so on the surprise note, and the whole world has been caught sort of flat-footed in this, is obviously the speed and now the increasing sophistication of artificial intelligence, and now the very strong implications for energy and for emissions. And all I would do is point the dear listener to a great conversation that we had with Vijay Kittapalli sometime last month. And very few, it seems, in 2020, just AI writ large. There are very, very few AI prognosticators, I think, who successfully predicted where it would be at in 2026.
Yeah, and Sarah, I think you kind of preempted almost a angle I was thinking of with this. I think when the show started, just kind of thinking for myself, that's kind of when I started a bit more in this space as well. I think we were clearly in kind of a climate policy window, and I think as you alluded, we've been in climate policy windows in the past. Like you could think of, the lead up to the Great Recession and, the US's attempts when Obama was in to get and, ultimately, not succeed at getting carbon pricing. So are you surprised that, I think it's not uncontroversial to say we're probably not in a climate policy window right now. Are you surprised that we're kind of are where we're at? I know lots of stuff, when the podcast started, kind of felt like there was this inevitable march forward on policy. We were even going through COVID, where there was big policy disruptions. We kept going with stuff like the clean electricity regulations or the zero emission vehicle mandate, and obviously, there's retrenchment now, or at least likely at the federal level. So I guess, is there surprise on kind of where things have gone as far as the political climate too?
I mean, again, it's hard to say like whether it's a surprise or not, but certainly I think it's not unheralded that, as you say, we see periods of sort of strong push on climate policy, which then results in real progress, I would say, on the cost of, climate alternatives or on the build out of infrastructure. And then there's a bit of a pushback that comes and a rollback of, a kind of a push against. And I mean, there's, the other thing that's changed since we started the podcast is I feel like I can't remember anybody's names anymore, but there's a woman professor in Santa Barbara we had as a guest whose first name is Leah, and I'm completely blanking on her. Leah Stokes. Thank you, Professor Stokes, who has written about this concept of kind of, as have many others, but certainly this concept of like the way that you can kind of like get a lot done in this climate policy window of sort of almost confusion, and you throw a lot of things at the wall and some things stick. And then also that incumbent industries tend to not pay a lot of attention to, threats to their industry until they get to a certain scale to be material and real. And so I would definitely describe the like most recent cycle that we've gone through as a bit of that, right? Like, going into it, we were in, single digits for sales of EVs and lower numbers for solar. And so I think there was like less of this sense of, oh no, we really need to worry about, from an incumbent perspective, again, the demand destruction for fossil fuel. And then things start to kind of take off and people get a little bit, feel that it's more real, let's say. But I think that there is a dynamic of like, it's a bit of a 2-step forward, 1 step back, because again, the fact that you have those windows, you have the deployment, you have, take the Alberta example where, okay, I mean, of course, now it's not a great example because the current government has managed to pause a lot of the new solar build, but certainly there was some government policies around the renewable energy procurement that really launched, I would claim, the renewable energy industry. And then even when those specific policies were rolled back, that was able to continue for some time too. So I think that, could we go faster and reach a 1.5 degree cap on warming if we had, perfect policies that continued in perpetuity? We certainly would have a better chance than we have with what we have. But I think it's also important to acknowledge that it's not a case of like all things are lost if you bring policy in and then it goes away. If it's policy that's designed in a way that, enables kind of that further development.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you kind of had said before, when I asked about what's changed, EVs and solar batteries, lots of growth. But I think, there's also, some of this policy retrenchment and, policy cycles that we're in as well. So is the premise energy versus climate? Is it more or less or kind of the same relevant as it was when the show started?
I think it's still relevant. I mean, we started this because of the suspicion or the fear that we're not having honest enough conversations about the hard truths to do with energy transition. And I don't think that's changed because we still have governments on 4-year election cycles who will, come out with a bunch of happy talk about, emissions reductions and what emissions reductions will be created by certain policies without acknowledging just some of the hard truths to do with Canada's emissions profile and especially to do with oil and gas production. So I don't think the core tension has gone away, nor have we gotten better at talking around it. It's still there. And I think those honest conversations, I'm pretty happy that EvC is a purveyor of them. And I think the need is still very much real.
Yeah, I like to believe, I'm trying to like check myself now. I like to believe that there's a little bit more of a recognition out there that like it's not possible to just increase oil production and reduce emissions at the same time, right? Or the concept that like in a decarbonizing world, you're going to have a peak in oil demand. I don't know. I guess you'd have to do like a person on the street interview to see if that's just a story I like to tell myself or reflected in a real way. But I think I agree that like that tension of energy versus climate is still very much there. The part that maybe we didn't acknowledge as much at the beginning, or at least is not in the name, I guess, that I think I over the years I'm coming to appreciate more and more is just like how much our energy and climate decisions and all these things live within, you know, the broader society and all of these other parts that come along with it, right? And that you can't really extract the energy or climate conversation from, you know, the conversation about politics and all these other things, which I think I like to think that we do talk about on the show. But I think I'll say, you know, as someone who was trained in the hard sciences, it's taken me a long time and a lot of like being willing to listen and challenge my own assumptions to learn that there's a lot more to it than, you know, just the physics or even the economics of the energy industry itself.
Yeah, I think I may have used this sort of pattern or mentioned this pattern before, but you know, with climate, you go through the cycle of, let's say, a company X denies the problem exists, denies that they're part of the problem, and then denies that there's anything they can do about the problem, and then denies that they can afford to do anything about the problem, and then they do something about the problem. And you have to work through those stages. And with the kind of the recent backsliding that we've seen, I was disappointed. I don't think we've seen many companies outside of, you know, core companies around the mega base in the US denying that the problem exists anymore. Rather, we have this kind of this avocado phenomena where people say, oh, climate exists, but to that point, we can't do anything about it. And we just need to batten down the hatches. But some companies can very quickly then deny that they're really part of the problem or deny that there's anything that they can do about the problem. And that's a pattern that repeats itself and I find sort of chronically disappointing.
That being said, though, like on the flip side, you know, I think, you know, we see with Hormuz and the war in Iran right now, you know, I think electricity and I think even just the nature geopolitically for a lot of countries of, you know, fossil fuel imports and their energy systems, you know, relying on fossil fuels is kind of an energy security or just, you know, the threat to their country's well-being. So I guess thinking about where things are going, do you think there's a point where kind of energy just is climate because, you know, a lot of the lowest cost technologies, you know, provide climate action kind of as a side consequence. And I think that's probably not a total solution to all decarbonization and reaching net zero. But yeah, I guess thinking where things are going, do you think, I guess maybe the premise won't be like irrelevant, but do you think it's gonna change in the future?
I'll just jump in quickly, Sarah. I would say, certainly, if you're dealing with the climate problem in this country and you're going in to talk to the federal government about the problem, you can't now go in and lead with the climate foot in the way that you could with the Trudeau government and treat that as an issue in isolation. And with the Trudeau government, the big difference was, hey, we've got these international commitments. We need to reduce our emissions. Let's say, here's a good pathway or technology to doing that. And here are the economic benefits that would come as a result. And now with the Carney government, it's you've got to lead with the economic benefits foot. Oh, well, you know, we want to develop this, you know, do a lot in carbon removal. You know, I want you to create a tax credit to incentivize, you know, surficial mineralization. And you're not saying, well, this is going to help Canada achieve its international climate commitments. It's going to create jobs, foreign direct investment for Canadian clean tech. It's going to create economic growth across these sectors, the value chain up and down. And oh, by the way, as a nice to have is Canada will be better equipped to meet its reduction targets. And that is very much a very marked contrast in the orientation of the two governments. So in effect, the Carney government is putting that into practice.
I agree with you, like on the underlying economics, that somehow on an even playing field, the lower carbon solutions are becoming less costly. I think the challenge that, as we're seeing play out around the world here in Alberta, other places, is that there's a lot that governments can do to tip the scales one way or the other. And so I don't think it's enough to say, well, you can just sit back and let the economics win out, because there is not a sort of even playing field that just exists by itself. And there's a lot of ways, especially when you get into tricky details of regulation and things like that you can really favor certain types of energy over others. So I don't think we're yet at the point of kind of complete inevitability, or there's nothing that can be done to certainly slow down the transition. At the same time, I think, it's not very much about the big push that's needed to make it happen, if that makes sense.
Fair enough. Yeah, well, maybe we'll have to come chat in another 6 years, and we'll see where things have been by then as well. So one other thing just that I've noticed with the podcast is, I think one thing that drew me and a lot of other folks kind of to the podcast was there was a focus on kind of inherently, just given that the three of you are in Alberta, you're in Alberta, that there was a kind of a focus on Alberta and Canada. But I think there's been more of a focus kind of internationally, kind of as the podcast has gone on. So is that intentional, or is that, I guess, what's behind that change?
I would challenge the premise of that question, Rob. I think we've always been internationally focused. And one thing we've done is we used to, in the canned intro that I'll do per episode, would sort of talk about the implications for Alberta, would name Alberta. Now we've taken that out, and we're really trying to draw the implications for Canada. However, if you look at our guest roster, like what we try to do with EvC is to bring in voices that aren't, if I can be crass, the same old that climate and energy geeks will have come across in other fora. And, we really try to work our Rolodexes to find those people, but then we're always bringing it back to Canada. And if I go back and look at previous seasons, we've always, I think, maintained about the same ratio between guests from abroad versus Canada-based guests. And a Canada-based academic tends to be the exception when we bring people on. There's my defense, saying, I challenge the premise to your question. We've always been international, but Sarah, go ahead and say what you think.
Yeah, I guess I'm like, I didn't do the math on the focus of the show between the episodes, so I'm honestly not sure.
Yeah, now I'm wishing I came quantitatively prepared to ask the question.
Well, we'll do that. We'll take that away. We'll do a Canada-based versus non-Canada-based guest analysis. But the number one criterion for choosing a guest is that guest clickbaity. Like that's what it's all about. Will people look at them and say, click, yes, because of that guest? That's the only reason we bring them on.
I guess maybe I will. Okay, so I said I didn't have anything to say. Now I'll say something. But I think it is worthwhile acknowledging and often exploring the way that things are different in Canada. And I know it's and in Alberta, and everybody wants to say they're the special, exception and things are different for them and all these things. But there are, I think, some meaningful ways that whether it's, the specific, say, challenges of solar in a northern climate or EVs, which again, as I think I've, said many times on the show, it's not that it means it doesn't work here, but just to sort of acknowledge that there are some different situations in Canada, and in particularly in a relatively northern part of Canada. Probably if people are listening to this from actual northern Canada, they're laughing at me, but Alberta compared with some of the other big provinces. And I think that's, as I said, that's important to acknowledge, both as we think about, what we're going to do to our energy systems here, but actually also so that we don't get caught in this trap of oh, well, that doesn't work so well here, therefore it's not going to become a big thing, realizing that, there's a very small percentage of the world's population that, chooses to live in a place where it routinely gets to be minus 35 outside, right? That's, if that's your sort of bar for measuring what's going on, you're going to be missing a lot of the world's energy systems. And so I do think that is important to maybe, to do both, to discuss what we're going to do here in Alberta, but then also make sure that our discussion of Alberta, especially because we are such a major energy exporter, is not missing what's going on in the rest of the world. Yeah,
Sarah, your particular part of northern Canada is 15 degrees right now?
Yeah, that's true. Today it's 15 degrees. Yesterday it was snowing. So,
There you go.
I've already got my floral shirt on.
People.
So for Sara, so Alberta, we're deeply tied to oil and gas. I think, especially, given current events, I think it's, more true than ever as far as our finances go. So is there a realistic path where we lead on transition rather than resisting it? Or is that forever wishful thinking?
In a nuanced way, there is a way that part of the province or part of our economy can lead on transition, right? And I think that of course, oil and gas is a major part of our industry, and that is a major employer, and a lot of people are working there, but we are not only an oil and gas province. And so there are other things that we are doing. And I think that those have an opportunity, whether it's in the robotic space or, I won't claim to be the expert on all the areas that Alberta is working in. I think we have a huge wealth of resources in the educational institutions and other institutions that the oil wealth has given us that really can create the situations to create a healthy economy. And I think we see that happening in various ways. When it comes to, will the oil and gas sector specifically be leading on this low carbon future? I think I'm ready at this point in my career to say a pretty resounding no. And like a good professional, I'll say I wrote a paper on it for anyone who wants to read it. It's called Mission Impossible: The Influence of Incumbent Industries on Mission-Oriented Innovation Policy Targeting Carbon Lock-in. So that's a whole lot of fancy words to basically say that incumbent industries are understandably, when you think about their incentives, going to do things to prevent their loss of the loss of their market share and the loss of their revenues. And when it comes to decarbonization, I think we now at this point understand that any net zero scenario that you draw has dramatically less fossil fuels being consumed. And I think any incumbent industry that's faced with trying to lead a transition that is basically leading them out of their main producing sector, it's just, as I argue in this paper, I don't think that there are any examples like that. There are certainly examples of incumbent industries that have led into areas where they could grow into, right? And so, you look at some of the innovation in the agricultural sector, the pharmaceutical sector, that arguably have, revolutionized those sectors. And it was the incumbents leading those, but they were well positioned to remain the incumbents, with the development of the new drugs or whatever it was. And so I think that is, back to Ed's point about avoiding the happy talk, I think it's possible. And, we have seen oil and gas players that have participated in growing some of the different new energy sectors. But I think they will, again, this is not even necessarily a value judgment as much as saying, what's their sort of economic incentive and what's the mandate that a publicly traded company CEO has from their investors. They will fight tooth and nail any policy that, even threatens, not super likely to decrease the market size and revenue from their core business, which is selling fossil fuels.
Sara, can I trot out the old wine analogy?
Please.
The old wine analogy. This is a crowd pleaser. If the world were to transition away from wine, you wouldn't expect the French to be at the head of that transition. And so I'm equally perplexed that people still kind of swallow this whole, if the world is going to transition away from fossil fuels, why would we expect Alberta to be leading that transition instead of fighting it tooth and nail with its claws dug into the ground? And that's, I think, a reality that we just don't acknowledge.
It is a nice story that we like to tell ourselves, though. So for Ed, we keep, Canada, Alberta, I'd say even the world, we keep setting climate targets and then missing them. Is there a point where target setting, becomes counterproductive? And if we were to say that, what would we replace it with? Would we be tethered to anything if we stopped setting targets?
Yeah, and I think in this case, there's a for and against argument. And first off, look at the Canadian context. So Canada's climate targets are pretty clear, and Canada is equally clearly off track. We've set these really ambitious reduction targets of 40 to 45% below 2005 levels, and an interim objective of 20% below 2005 by 2026. So that's the first one is a 2030 target. And not surprisingly, we're not actually close to meeting those targets. Not bad on 2026, nowhere close to where we need to be by 2030. Now, you would say, well, why do we set these targets? The arguments for, I think, is, think of it like a donkey's feed bag. And you have the target. We're going faster because of the targets. And targets actually force governments to really say where they're trying to get to and create that pressure for continuity across election cycles. The argument against is, well, I think, as you alluded to, Rob, if you repeatedly miss targets, it just erodes your credibility. And frankly, they can border on climate virtue signaling and symbolic politics. It's great announcements and, great ribbon cutting, but very weak implementation. And Canada has shown it's got very low accountability for non-delivery. Although, to Canada's credit, it is trying to create more accountability and has done that through legislation. But at some point, then these targets just become a form of climate theater. So, are those for and against? Where do I stand? I think I still stand in support of the targets for those arguments. You need to tell companies, you need to tell provinces the direction of travel, where we're going. And without them, policy just can kind of drift into this pile of disconnected measures with, no clear path for success. But I would encourage we're to set these targets, make them more realistic, and making them more realistic is having that hard conversation. We can achieve this very difficult ambition reduction target, but we can't do that and grow oil and gas production. Let's cancel the happy talk and say, hey, we want to grow oil and gas production, as both the province and the federal government want to do, but that's going to come at the expense of climate targets. And we're okay with that because we'll capture lots of revenue that pays for government, for schools and hospitals. Or no, these targets are really important and our international credibility rests on them. So then at that point, we have to say, we can't grow oil and gas production. In fact, we probably have to reduce it. That is like political anathema, but I think that's the honest conversation to have.
And just like that, we're back to the premise of the show, energy versus climate.
Yeah, there we go. A plug for the show.
I was going to say, it's like it's not the targets, it's what you do with them, right? And I think you do somehow not having them makes it even harder to have those honest conversations about getting there or not. But just having them isn't enough.
Let's get, if we're good at announcing something by 2030 or 2035, let's get equally good at governing in 2026.
Yeah, it reminds me of a lot of my work in electricity policy. I've often gone kind of jaded about, models and, the efficacy of the models. But, without models, we're really just going on vibes. So I think, targets that feel similar to me, like, they're important. They can be flawed, but without them, I think we're just kind of untethered. Okay, well, why don't we go through a couple rapid fire questions, starting with the first one. Nuclear is having a moment in Canada. SMRs, refurbishments, different provincial interests. Provincial interests, I'd say, outside of Ontario and New Brunswick. Is this real momentum, or are we still a decade away from it mattering at scale?
Well, as we talked about oil sands alliance rebranding, this is probably my third nuclear renaissance. And at some point, it stops being a renaissance and it just starts being a pattern. So yes, nuclear is having a moment again. It's had previous moments. Is it going to be any different? Hard to say, but I'm actually cautiously optimistic. And I say that as one who is in support of nuclear playing not just its current role in the Canadian energy mix. I could see it playing an expanded role. And that's not a position that I had, say, 10 years ago. And just as a little plug, after this recording, we're bringing on Sarah's EvC colleague, Jason Donev, to unpack nuclear in Canada in a more thorough way. So this is just a teaser, including, maybe we'll talk about where we stand on nuclear. But the big change with what's happened previously is that we may be reversing the negative learning curve. And that sounds like a double negative. But where nuclear has been in project after project, each project costs more and takes longer than the previous one. Instead of the usual benefits from project experience, you drive down the cost and it takes less amount of time to actually build it out. And that's happening particularly in China, which is going through a very clear nuclear renaissance and adding lots to its grid. So I'm cautiously optimistic that we can do that in Canada as well. And we'll have to see. We got, Darlington's done in refurbishment. Bruce Power's halfway done. Next up is Pickering. And we've got finally an SMR. Looks like it's going to be built in Ontario. And Capital Power here in Alberta is looking at SMRs. So it certainly is on the lips of decision makers now. I definitely did not put the rapid in rapid fire. I put the drawn out, long-winded in rapid fire there. So I should shut up.
You set the bar nice and low, Ed. I'll try to outdo you and just say that I think nuclear is becoming more important in some places around the world. I don't see it playing a big role in Alberta. I think maybe marginal in some parts of Canada that have some history around it, but look forward to our next discussion.
And actually, here's a rapid fire comment on that, Sarah. I can see that Alberta's energy only structure is really challenging for long lived assets. So with nuclear, it's much easier in, say, Ontario and Saskatchewan with like crown corporations.
I'd say the energy only structure is also really hard for supply surplus too. And nuclear's usual need to be always on is going to be difficult as well. But is the nuclear show, is it going to be live? Because I've got some other questions. Maybe I'm going to have to attend the recording for that one if it is.
It sure is. And because you're doing this, Rob, once again, how about we give you the first question on that show?
Sounds good. So just going deeper into the rapid fire. So one I've always wanted to ask you folks is, I think all of us, we bike sometimes to get around for transportation. Canmore has really great cycling infrastructure. Calgary, I'd say our cycling infrastructure is better than we like to say, but we always complain about the stuff we have. I don't often see, in climate strategies, like Canada's climate strategy or climate strategies, say from the IEA, like the role of mode shift in transportation. Do you see that being a big thing? And is that something we should be taking more seriously? Should we be looking beyond EVs as well for actually, reducing those emissions associated with transportation fuels?
I'll say yes, definitely. And I think you're right that I would say the whole bucket of reducing vehicle miles traveled doesn't get a lot of play. I'll throw a shout out to David Weisskopf, who talks about it certainly in the context of California. Do I want to say why I think that is? I mean, I think there is a little bit of for some people, it feels a little too we're going to prevent you from driving a car. We're going to ban you from doing so. But I think there is some renewed excitement and interest around the idea of showing people that it's not about you can never drive a car, but it's more around there's just a better mix of transportation modes that you can use that's the right fit for the job, depending on how far you're going and what are you doing. And it's not a matter of sacrifice, but it can actually be, more pleasant and much cheaper. And I think it's pretty amazing. Now I'm doing the non-rapid fire, but I think it's pretty amazing to see what cities like Paris have done in a really short amount of time that have really just completely changed the makeup of the way that people move around.
So just doing a couple kind of maybe going back to kind of thinking about the show. So, you've had the podcast for, I believe, 6 years now. What's a climate or energy truth that's changed the truth you used to hold that you've changed your mind about over the duration of the podcast?
Oh, I've got one. It's a little, I don't know if it's too niche, but I was going to install an all electric heat pump in my home with a backup resistance heating. And then I started thinking about what happens if everybody does that on the block and what happens to the distribution system. So I am no longer all in on all electric heating in ultra cold climates or in homes that, can't manage with a heat pump alone. But I actually think we need to be a little bit more thoughtful about that.
I've changed my mind about the need for climate stabilization. And by stabilization, I mean some type of intervention in the climate to either pull CO2 out of the atmosphere or something like sunlight reflection that David works on as a way of trying to just stabilize our climate and ultimately keep people safe. Net zero ain't worth a hill of beans if you end up just locking in a dangerous level of warming. We actually have to figure out how to cool the planet.
Who's the best guest you've had on, and how come?
I will take first crack, but this is like asking us to pick our favorite child amongst our children. So there are so many good ones. We've had guests who like drive downloads that are really popular. And Blake Schaefer created a bunch of downloads. Dore Vino from Hannah, Alberta, talking about just transition. That was a hugely popular show. Kim Stanley Robinson, because of Ministry for the Future. For me, it was really Catherine Hamilton. And why Catherine Hamilton? The keen-eyed or sharp-eared listener will recognize her as 1/3 of the Energy Gang. Energy versus Climate was partly inspired by the Energy Gang. She's just a very thoughtful, amazing observer and commentator, and we managed to get her before she retired. And it was really just Sarah and me interviewing her. It was like not even a full episode, but it was like, for me, that was like a big checkbox. We got someone from the Energy Gang on.
That's hilarious. We did not coordinate this, but that's actually one of the two that I wrote down. So just also because I am such a Catherine Hamilton fangirl, and I think in some ways Energy versus Climate is really like a tribute podcast to the Energy Gang. I will leave it to the listeners as an exercise to decide which of our co-hosts we think maps to their co-hosts. But definitely that was a fun one. But I also have to throw a shout out to Blake Schaefer, my close collaborator, who I continue to work a lot with on electricity topics at U Calgary too. So.
Yeah, the politically correct answer is say my favorite guest is the guest who is on most recently.
There you go. Well, Blake's great, and shout out to the Energy Gang for sure. I think that's actually the first climate and energy podcast I've ever listened to. So maybe you're going to have to collect the trio, get Stephen Lacey and get Jigger Shaw on here, especially now that Jigger's not working for the Department of Energy anymore. Okay, one more. So if the energy transition goes well, what does Canada look like in 2050? Can you give us one image?
I'll give you an image: more wild space and more invisible energy. And by that, a country that produces energy without it dominating the landscape.
You can tell I did not prepare for the rapid fire questions before. My utopia energy transition really links back to more of those, like, more equality and comfort and people just moving around and being comfortable in their spaces and having their needs met in a way that is not happening for everybody today.
Well, with that, I think, we've gone probably a little bit longer than we all intended. So yeah, thanks so much for having me as the host. And thanks so much for telling us a little more about yourselves and where you think things are all going in our world of energy versus climate.
Well, Rob, you're a fantastic host, and so much so I'm going to be looking over my shoulder now, as we walk into the future, knowing that while we're trying to replace David with AI, you could be a wonderful replacement for me. So it's with mixed feelings that I say you did a great job. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. It's been a lot of fun. Of course, it's always fun to, talk about yourself, but just thinking about how much things have changed and, the things have been going for a little while, and it's been, I definitely did not expect that we would necessarily still be going 6 years on. So it's been a lot of fun to be a part of. And, I learn a lot always from our guests and our co-hosts and from just, being forced to answer questions myself. So. And it's, people that will listen to me, because my kids still, they came home with some homework the other day that included questions about, what was it? One was like, how will things change as EVs are adopted? And the other one was if subsidies are enough to enable EV adoption. And I was like, so ready to tell them, what I thought about these two things that I have literally written papers about, and they were just not interested.
Sarah, I had this wonderful milestone. I was chatting with my 19-year-old daughter, who is a first-year UBC science student. And we hit upon the fact that in my work and her studies, we had both referenced the same UBC study that's going on right now. and it's to do with carbon removal. And I said, oh, well, great. If you're interested, like we did a whole show on carbon removal that you could. No, I'm not interested. Thank you. It's like, but if I ever get one of my kids to listen to a full episode of EvC, I could probably then retire. Thanks for listening to Energy versus Climate. The show is created by David Keith, Sarah Hastings Simon, and me, Ed Whittingham, and produced by Emmett Tandon with help from Michael Edmonds. Our title and show music is The Wind Up by Brian Lips. This season of Energy versus Climate is produced with the support of the North Family Foundation, the Conscon Foundation, the Trottier Family Foundation, and you, our generous listeners. Sign up for updates and exclusive webinar access at energyversusclimate.com and review and rate us on your favorite podcast platform. It really does help new listeners to find the show.